Hi, everybody. Welcome to Elevated Perspectives, Critical Conversations in Cloud Computing. This is a new event series. We're presented in collaboration with our AWS partners. The idea is to bring you the latest cloud computing insights, trends, and technical practices for R&D teams in life sciences. Hi, I'm Michael Riener. I'm the President and CEO of RCH Solutions, and today here with Phil Eschallier, our Chief Technology Officer. Joining us is Eric Zimmerman. Eric is the Principal Healthcare and Life Sciences Business Development at AWS. Today, we're talking about cloud. Specifically, we're talking about scale in the cloud. Eric, thanks for joining us. Before we begin, if you could take a minute to introduce yourself, then we'll jump right in.
My pleasure, Michael. Thank you, and thank you, RCH, for having me. So I guess for a quick background, my name's Eric. Background on the bioengineering side originally, and then instead of getting my MD, PhD, I sold out and I went to the venture world. So I spent about a decade as a VC doing early stage biotech platform investing and growth stage medtech investing, both in San Francisco and Boston. And then while I was there, I also co-founded an ophthalmology therapeutics company that went public. I then moved to Austin, Texas, to settle down with my wife and my son, where we're all from. And I got recruited over to AWS to join the healthcare and life science team and specifically lead our venture capital and startups initiative here. So great to be here.
Nice. Again, thank you and welcome. All right, so let's jump in. First topic we're going to talk about today is scale, the scale challenges in cloud computing. So Eric, I'll start with you. Can you shed some light on maybe specific challenges that startup biotech or even emerging companies and even big pharmas face when they embark on building a scalable compute environment?
So this is something that we think about a lot. And I've even spent some of my time at AWS, for nights and weekends being a product manager back in the day, although my coding is not up to snuff. You know, the healthcare and life science field is interesting because there's a lot of really deep technical domain expertise, whether you're a clinician or, physician, scientist, what have you. But I wouldn't always say that this field has been the most tech forward just because of, significant security compliant risks. Obviously, this stuff really matters a lot. And so what we've seen is that a lot of, at the really early stage side, a lot of founders, they may be truly world-class scientists or clinicians or entrepreneurs, but they're not necessarily DevOps or SecOps experts, right? And, they've now heard of the cloud, which wasn't necessarily always true, half a dozen years ago, but how to get the most out of the cloud is not necessarily, what their training was based on. And honestly, we see something similar at pharma in that there's a ton of incredible science being done, right? And there's a lot of historical knowledge on how to do that science, especially on the wet lab. But once you start kind of baking in that in silico piece, that's what I'll call. So instead of in vitro or vivo, in silico, which would be, cloud compute or, basically enabled by computers, it opened the door for a lot more scale, but it's still not necessarily a core competency that's built up over, been built up over 10 or 50 or 100 years for these big pharma. So how do we lower the barriers of entry, for these researchers to really conduct the best science in the world, but also be built on, some of the best architectures and infrastructures in the world?
Yeah, we see a lot of the same things. It's interesting. You get these really intelligent, well-meaning people, and they have to make a decision. Do they jump right in to use the cloud, or do they focus on seeing science? And it's a constant struggle they have to make as a business decision. Phil, let me ask you a question, and this is specific to startups. When a startup or emerging company, what I mean by a startup is obviously, several people together with a great idea, and emerging where they take that next step to not only scale up the organization, but scale up the cloud. So we're talking about companies like that. How should they balance the immediate needs that they have with kind of the long-term scalability? And I think we've talked in the past about this concept of, quote, working backwards and how it applies to that scenario. So can you talk about how they balance these two needs?
Yeah, so thank you, Michael. And I have to agree with Eric. I think one of the barriers coming in is a lack of skill in the IT, the cloud space as it applies to life sciences, specifically the innovation layer. But what they end up doing, what we see a lot is that their temptation is to go out and find a template somewhere. They spin up a single account in the cloud, and it really is a springboard in and gets them going, but it's a dead end as far as extensibility and scale. And so the recommendation would be to avoid the temptation to start out overly simple and to put a little bit of time in up front to get the right infrastructure in place and the right architecture in place. As far as working backwards, I mean, it would be really great if we had a crystal ball and we could see in 5 years we're going to be X, Y, and Z, and we're going to need such and such. But that's very difficult, especially at the pace that the path to innovation is evolving. So particularly, I really like to have us prioritize that flexible infrastructure where it's a core set of services across a multi-account model that's extensible and supports a multi-governance model, so that if you need to pivot or you didn't anticipate a certain growth area, you're not stuck.
Okay. Let me ask you both a question. We're talking about scale here, and we hit some challenges or hurdles. Can you think of any off the top of your head, these key challenges or hurdles that they need to overcome? And this may relate to trends in the industry. It may relate to operational issues they see. Are there things that stick out to you as far as hurdles that they need to overcome? Eric, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a ton of hurdles, and it almost depends on the stage. Working backwards, I did appreciate you throwing that in there. That's obviously a core kind of Amazon principle or philosophy. But when we were thinking about what do early stage biotech founders and companies need, we tried to work backwards from assume a final stage of a clinical or a commercialization based, or like a sales and marketing based company, and then work backwards to preclinical and then research. Because again, at the end of the day, you want to be able to do QA, QC, regulatory, clinical, and then pharmacology and translational medicine and research. But that's not necessarily the most important or at all required necessarily on day one. Day one, it could be lab ops or biology or just basic chemistry. And so we really try to help companies figure out what is the core of what they need to be doing, and focus on that. Could be core infrastructure, high performance compute, workflows, automation, single source of truth for data, all those different things, and then make sure that they're set up to reduce as much long-term tech debt as possible. As Phil was saying, and I do hope I find a place where I disagree with Phil by the end of the call. I find that always makes these discussions more interesting. But again, we found that a single button kind of click to start is nice, but it does, for companies that really have long-term plans to scale, it can be sort of tough to switch. And so if you make that a little bit bigger, a little bit more mature kind of investment up front with a multi-account architecture and some other best practices, it really kind of lets your company transition to clinical trial transformation or manufacturing or commercial enablement with real-world evidence. And kind of avoid pitfalls in each of those specific categories.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be a nice segue when we talk to best practices, which is coming next.
I know. I'm trying not to get too ahead of myself.
It's a lot of good stuff to talk about. You hit on a key theme we've seen, and I'll share the same question with Phil, which is companies make a decision. Do we jump to this point solution? Do we buy this tool to solve this problem for this workflow? Or do we look at it from a larger perspective? We see that all the time. And I'll ask Phil, back to the original question, the key hurdles that you see in your role as Chief Technical Officer and really as strategic advisor, what trends are you seeing with these companies, either big or small, in terms of hurdles, and what can they do to overcome them?
So I think we could probably write a book on this, but let's see if we get to an answer. I think that if we set budget aside, because cloud costs, it's pay as you go, and it's going to be consumption-based model. So if we're not hindered by budget, I think really the greatest hindrance, other than getting stuck in a bad reference architecture, is the temptation to just do point solutions or try to piecemeal things together. And then on top of that, there has to be the right kind of governance model, because if your governance model hinders your ability to be agile or nimble in the cloud, it's going to be rate limiting. But overall, back to the right reference architecture, being able to scale horizontally with additional accounts or scale within an application using cloud-based elasticity, plan for it, get the right skills on the team, and it will come together.
Great. All right, so let's move into that second part, which Eric alluded to nicely, which is best practices and maybe make some recommendations. So there's two parts to this. There's actually two questions. I'll ask both of you the same question. Are there a few general cloud strategies or best practices that teams can be using to build a scalable compute environment? Not only scalable, but perhaps a cost-effective scalable environment as well. Phil, I'll start with you since you're already teed up.
Okay, so I think there's some fundamental tenets here as a baseline, and really what needs to happen for a startup or a company that's moving from a path that wasn't successful is to look at what's needed. And from the top down, you have to have a priority on security and compliance. Now, if you're just doing research, maybe it's just security up front, but you can't let compliance go as an idea. You have to be prepared to handle a multi-governance model in your cloud, and that some of the governance models might be for consolidated IT services, your discovery, early development, then development, preclinical, clinical, and so on, data science. I mean, they're all going to have different models, but you can't have a single governance model that handles all this, because if you're doing clinical, that's going to hinder the pace of research.
Good point. Eric, how about you? Do you have a few general cloud strategies or best practices that you or AWS recommends for life sciences?
I do. And I really try to make these approachable, because again, I understand not everyone spends all day, every day thinking about the cloud. And so I sort of bucket things, at least for, if I'm talking to an early stage company, into infrastructure and applications, right? Infrastructure would be, built on top of AWS, your research VPCs, your management VPCs, your NAT gateways, your bastion hosts, audits, logs, configs, all that good stuff. And so that's sort of, a big part of what Phil's talking about is, how can you set up, a lightweight, manageable, multi-account architecture that has the appropriate kind of controls and audits and logs and, kind of management and access layers. So it doesn't necessarily burden your team, with too much, but sets you up for success, right? And allows people to access the data they need and the resources they need. And so, we're a big fan of, using infrastructure as code for those types of solutions, because to be honest, and I'm sure Phil and I will talk about this a lot more, a lot of those things that I mentioned are not necessarily life science specific when you really get down to brass tacks or best practices. There are just good ways to set things up. And so we had the Biotech blueprint back in the day. We now have a landing zone accelerator that's great. But we also, try to work with partners that have kind of their own solutions based on AWS best practices, where, startups and really anyone can kind of work with them. So instead of paying for a net new build, they're really paying for the configuration and the training and enablement. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece would be the application layer. And that would be more of what, in this case, scientists would be excited about, and more of when kind of that aha moment happens. So that would be, lab ops or, biology operations or chemistry operations. And so that can be anything from complex robotics to bioinformatics pipelines to, ELNs to LIMS systems, what have you. And those are usually built on top of the infrastructure. And if you don't have the right foundation, you won't have the right kind of security and rules and access management policies for those applications. And it will hinder your ability to do basic science and research, which is at the end of the day, the real moneymaker or the value driver of the company.
Yeah, we see that quite a bit, without exception, almost all the time, where you walk into a startup or an emerging company and people have ideas of what they want to do, and they're great ideas and they're best practices, which for the most part they've probably brought from another company, maybe to a big pharma, because either it worked for them or they operated in a silo because they had to. And the risk they run is throwing those tools at the solutions without thinking about the proper foundation. something such as the Biotech Blueprint, which, thank you, we've used to great success, to step back, put that proper foundation in place for the house, and then build everything up from there. So it makes it not only scalable, but more efficient and productive for everybody. So let's talk about tools and services then. Can you talk about some AWS tools or services that are particularly beneficial for startups or emerging companies to achieve that scalability?
Yeah. So, I'll talk about the infrastructure layer in particular, although we can also touch on applications if you'd like, because there's a ton of great ones, that we work with a lot. I think on the tools and services side, I mentioned infrastructure as code, but I'm a huge, huge believer in that. AWS has our own CDK, which is basically writes CloudFormation templates was the old version. But whether you use Terraform or another kind of infrastructure as code solution, those are a great way to kind of accelerate your adoption of, basic VPCs, VPNs, S3, IAM policies, system managers, CloudWatch. I could, name a ton of AWS services that are valuable, but at the end of the day, if you can kind of get that baseline of getting, the right VPC peering and right networking done and right, IAM kind of baseline permissions, that you can use for your organization, it really just helps accelerate everything. And so, AWS obviously publishes our own reference architectures like the landing zone accelerator that I mentioned. But I would say, as much as I wish there was, one solution to rule them all, so to speak, there's a lot of different ways to do things correctly in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based on both personal preference, need, use case, skills. And that's really where we find working with a partner like an RCH is so valuable for startups and enterprises alike, is that they have very prescriptive guidance on, the best, easiest, fastest way to get started based on, their own landing zone or AWS's kind of guidance, and can help kind of train and enable.
Great.
Bill, I know I copped out a little bit because I named 10, AWS services, but didn't necessarily hammer on one. I'm happy to go as deep as you want on any of those because I certainly have my favorites, but
Okay.
I think philosophically, that's how I feel.
All right. Would love to hear them at some point. Hey, Phil, how about you? You and your team have a lot of hands-on experience with specific AWS tools and services. Are there any that jump out to you that help with the scalability issue?
Well, I think there's two parts to this. There's the scalability, and to that, I don't want to beat it into the ground, but infrastructure as code and automated orchestration is absolutely a fundamental tenet of everything we do. It's repeatable, it's versioned, it's also qualifiable if you need it. So it really helps you, the individual cloud ops team members, from having to reinvent the wheel. But I look at a couple other tools as far as scaling, and one of the ones that's important to us is the AWS calculator. And as trivial as that may sound, being able to talk to a client, talk through a potential solution or components of a solution, and be able to go price it out and give them an idea of what this is going to cost so that there's no surprises, has really been important to us. And beyond that, scale could be infinite potentially, or within the confines of a cloud provider's capacity, but budgets are never infinite. So one of the things that we really like to do is use the AWS budgets to put alerts in for daily spends or projected monthly spends. It's not so much, and this is a cost control angle, but if you want to scale, you want to make sure you're not shooting yourself in the foot in the process. But one of the last things about scale is that you can't have a human going in and looking at all the logs all the time and what might be going wrong. So an automated tool that does monitoring, alerting, ideally some self-healing, something like guard duty is really important. It's not an AWS tool, but we also are a fan of Turbot guardrails. And so this type of tool can keep you protected as you scale.
Okay, great. I do want to, excuse me, finish up with this technical track you guys have kind of led me to, and there are two things that jump out, which we're big fans of. I'd like you to elaborate on infrastructure as code, talk a bit more about that, why that's important and beneficial for them. And I've heard this theme of technical debt, and we talk about tech debt that people have brought with them or what they've created, and why that could be a particular challenge for companies as they enter into the cloud. Eric, you want to tackle that first?
Sure. So I guess on the infrastructure as code side, this we found is a good approachable way for software engineers and dev people to, interact with the cloud, and kind of build things that are scalable, repeatable, again, almost templatized, so you can kind of, turn the crank, so to speak, and have things that are standardized, which is super valuable. And so, as I mentioned, whether it's, you know, Amazon CDK or Terraform or Palomi or, one of the others, they all are good solutions for being able to do that and give you kind of a way to interact with, cloud services and solutions that's a little bit more, native or comfortable for a lot of engineers. And I would say, the extension to that, which I didn't mention, but I probably should have, would be some of the AWS managed services. It's sort of a cousin to that almost, in that we try to, basically obfuscate as much of that, DevOps burden as possible, right? And I know y'all are big fans, but we just announced AWS Health Omics and AWS Health Lake and AWS Health Imaging. And so the idea of having a managed service where, a software partner can store and query and analyze genomic or transcriptomic data, and generate insights, just through, the AWS platform, that is really powerful. You don't necessarily have to worry so much about like picking the right instance type, for example, or storage costs. And so, that's sort of where combination of infrastructure as code for getting the baseline and then managed services is a way to reduce the long-term burden, which, was the second part of your question. So tech debt.
Yeah.
So we find that a lot of companies, especially startups, want to go as fast as possible. And that makes sense, right? That's, I would argue, one of the biggest advantages that a startup has over, a larger company is the ability to be nimble and fail fast or succeed fast. Well, that's great until all of a sudden you need to be a little bit more enterprise grade, or you start marching towards the clinic. You have a preclinical candidate, you got your IND enabled, IND approved. Then what? Then you're starting to look at HIPAA, eligibility or high trust or SOC 2. And so all sorts of different security and compliance frameworks. And it's much easier to set yourself up, with those in mind, those goals in mind later on, than to try to, rip everything out and replace, or, try to, piecemeal solutions, that kind of end up being bubblegum and duct tape. And so that's where we think a lot about that risk reward of like, okay, we don't want to burden people too early, because if you don't need to be, I trust certified or SOC 2 compliant, like, maybe that's not necessarily what you should prioritize, but there are a lot of best practices that feed into those kind of common frameworks that are worth doing from day one, that don't add burden, but will save you a lot of headaches in the future.
Great. Thank you. That's very helpful. Phil, do you want to wrap up? We'll let you comment on tech debt and infrastructure as code.
Yeah, I think it's I think Eric's hit the nail on the head. But even if a startup's only goal is to identify a target and have someone buy it or buy the company, the idea of infrastructure as code is still valuable, because if you look at it just like software engineering, where version 1 has this, version 1.1 has this, and so on and so on. And if you introduce a bug between two versions, you have a good sense of what's going on, what's changed. If you need to go backwards in time, you have version history of your infrastructure as code. You go back to a known working point and rework forward. And again, the whole qualifiable aspect, you don't want to have someone go in, hit the console and say, I'll just spin this up, it's super easy. And then there's the essence of your tech debt, because something's running, but if it were to be destroyed, you don't know how to replace it or recreate it. So qualifying it is not just a nice thing to have, but if you move into the validated GXP world later, it's a great foundation for starting that work. So yeah, definitely want to avoid tech debt at all cost.
Great, thank you. I just want to reiterate a couple of the things that we hit on today as we scale it. There's ways to leverage the tools. There's ways to leverage automation and use things like DevOps. And there's a way to identify what some of these bumps are going to be in the road that you can predict and make plans accordingly as you scale. But really the whole idea is to plan today for where you want to be as a company in 3 to 5 years from now. And that means putting a proper foundation in place and a proper plan in place. So I want to thank both of you today for joining me. This is very informative and helpful. I'd like to remind everybody listening to this that we have upcoming episodes. In addition to this, you can find those at our website at rcsolutions.com/elevated perspectives. And I would also encourage you to provide feedback there on anything you've heard today and in our future sessions as well. So thank you, Phil, and thank you, Eric, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody else, for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you.